Good morning, everyone. Happy to welcome everybody today and call this hearing to order. Today, we're here to discuss President Biden's fiscal year 2024 budget proposal for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. To help inform our discussion, we again welcome Martha Williams. I told her I left my own Martha in Wilmington this morning to jump on a train, come down here, and she said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going to go listen to another Martha." And we're happy that you could join us today. Director of the service, and before our committee, Director Williams, we just thank you for your service. We thank you for joining us today. President's budget request includes just over $2 billion for the Fish and Wildlife Service, $2 billion. I think that's about an 18% increase in funding over 2023 enacted levels. This increase would provide much needed resources at a time when we're asking the agencies to do more, a lot more, especially to permit infrastructure projects efficiently. First, as habitat loss and climate change continue to drive biodiversity loss in our country and around the world, the service's mission of conserving, of protecting and enhancing our nation's wildlife and habitats has never been more critical. In addition, the agency's role in the federal permitting process is especially important, given the historic passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, along with the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. We know that the resulting investments from these laws are already starting to drive a revolution in clean energy development, infrastructure improvement, and climate adaptation. But as part of its mission and congressionally mandated responsibilities, the service must consult with other agencies to ensure that we are deploying these investments and permitting projects in a way that do not jeopardize species. However, neither the bipartisan infrastructure law, which we helped write literally in this room, nor the Inflation Reduction Act included direct funding for the service's responsibilities relating to permitting. So in other words, Congress has increased the number of environmental reviews the service must complete, but has not yet provided the resources the service needs to meet this added workload. I think we have an obligation to do something about that, and I hope we will. I've heard some of our colleagues raise concerns about the service's Endangered Species Act consultation process, leading to delays and backlogs in the permitting process. Well, lack of agency capacity is a major contributing factor to bottlenecks. President's 2024 budget would provide the agency with adequate resources to improve efficiencies in the environmental review process, while also protecting species. We can do both, and we must do both. President's budget request also includes a $50 million increase for planning and consultation activities, which would support an additional 225 full-time employees for this work. With this increase, the service expects to be able to complete more than 280 additional formal consultations and 3,100 additional informal consultations annually. Make no mistake, that will make a real difference. Some of our colleagues have also suggested that Congress should just consider bypassing the service's role in permitting, but it is in my strongly held belief, a belief that I think most of the people in our country also share, that we have a moral imperative to protect the species with which we share our one and only planet. And what a lot of people might be surprised to learn is that preserving biodiversity has clear economic benefits. According to a 2022 report by J.P. Morgan, recent biodiversity losses have cost up to $20 trillion per year. That's $20 trillion, trillion with a T, in lost ecosystem services. These services include protecting our food supplies, as well as providing clean air and clean water. For example, our food production relies on biodiversity for pest control, for pollination, and for soil fertility. Healthy and biodiverse forests and oceans absorb more carbon dioxide. And we all rely on biodiverse ecosystems to provide clean water to drink. When we lose biodiversity, nature stops providing these precious services. And while biodiversity loss presents a real threat to our economy and environment, the good news is that our nation's strong environmental laws help preserve biodiversity. The President's budget enables the service to fulfill its responsibilities under these laws, which include the Migratory Bird Treaty, the Lacey Act, and the Endangered Species Act. The service also manages over 850 acres of lands, millions of acres of lands and waters throughout the National Wildlife Refuge System, some of the most beautiful land in America, land and water in America. The fiscal year 2024 budget would address the major staffing shortage experienced across our refuge system over the last decade by providing funding for an additional 168 full-time employees, such as refuge managers, law enforcement, and visitor service specialists. In Delaware, we're proud of our 2 national wildlife refuges. They're located east of Dover, southeast of Dover, probably about 50 miles away, and they are a joy to visit. It's just a real jewel for our country. I have an opportunity to visit these refuges quite frequently, and in fact, I'm looking forward to visiting Prime Hook National Wildlife Refuge next week to see our world-famous red knots come by for lunch, flying from the southern part of our planet all the way up to the North Pole. These tiny birds stop at our beaches to feast on horseshoe crab eggs during their famous migration journey from the southern tip of South America to the tundra of the North Arctic. Bombay Hook and Prime Hook are major destinations for bird watchers from all over the world, meaning that these destinations support our eco-tourism industry in Delaware as well. Some people think that just because we have, I think, more 5-star beaches than any other state, that's why tourists come to Delaware. A lot of people come from all over the world because they're interested in birding, including the red knot. Both of our wildlife refuges have been short-staffed for the last couple of years. We need to address this shortfall for our refuges in Delaware and, frankly, for those refuges that are located around the country. Let me conclude, if I may, by saying that when Congress tasks an agency with an important mission and an increased workload, we must in turn provide sufficient funding so that they can get the job done that they're expected to do. The budget that we're discussing today recognizes this responsibility and the opportunity that comes with that responsibility. With that, we look forward to hearing more from Director Williams today on how the President's 2024 budget would support the important work that she oversees at the Fish and Wildlife Service. Before we hear from you, we look forward to hearing from our ranking member, Senator Capito, for her comments. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, and thank you, Director Williams, for being here, and thank you for the open door of communication and the visit to West Virginia. Certainly appreciate that. We have discussed in previous hearings the frustrations that I've had with the delays the consultation under the Endangered Species Act has added to projects in West Virginia and elsewhere. Our State Department of Transportation has faced delays in road and bridge projects. Our Department of Environmental Protection has dealt with delays in consultation on not only active mining permits, but also on projects to remediate our abandoned mine sites through the AML projects or programs. Local government officials have come to me to express frustration with delays to water and sewer projects, and private industry has faced delays due to a backlog of ESA consultation requests. So you've heard many of these concerns from me when you came to West Virginia when we talked on the phone just most recently, and I appreciate the fact that you do listen and try to make those things better. I do want to acknowledge and thank the Elkins Field Office for its work on the biological opinions on 2 major projects in West Virginia, the Mountain Valley Pipeline and Nucor's sheet steel mill. I also want to acknowledge the additional resources that you have allotted in reviewing projects in West Virginia through creating 3 new full-time positions in the Elkins Field Office and by detailing staff from elsewhere in the service to help address the backlog of project reviews in our state. However, more work is needed, and the service must better utilize its resources to ensure that projects are reviewed in a timely manner. Section 7 consultations under the Endangered Species Act are the poster child for project delays and bureaucratic roadblocks in the federal environment review and permitting process. Fairly or not, other agencies often cite that the slow Section 7 consultations as the justification for not advancing their own permitting process. The administration continues to blame these delays solely on a lack of funding and staffing. Currently, West Virginia state agencies, the private sector, and even other federal agencies are funding positions at the service's field office in Elkins. This feels like West Virginians are kind of getting taxed twice to do the same work that the service does. We even experience delays with getting the very paperwork in place that establishes cooperative agreements for my state's agencies to even use the taxpayer dollars to fund staff for the field office. West Virginia Department of Highways has been funding a position at the field office for 10 years. Let me say that again, 10 years. Even so, the West Virginia DOH is willing to fund a second position at the field office to move consultations for roads and bridges through the process. There's a lot of money flowing on these roads and bridges projects. But unfortunately, the West Virginia DOH has been locked in a back-and-forth negotiations with the field office for months over how to do just that. I do not believe that adding a second position with the same duties should take months to negotiate after 10 years of experience of working the same kind of agreement. Additionally, the process agreement between West Virginia DOH, the Federal Highways, and the service, which we discussed during your visit last August, still has not been finalized months later. The backlog of biological assessments and consultations seems to never end, and recent species listings and rulemakings by the service don't seem to be helping the problem. The service admits the northern long-eared bat populations are declining due to effects separate and apart from infrastructure projects or economic development activities. One of the delayed projects is important to my state, the Coalfields Expressway, which recently received a rural grant through the IIJA. There are similar stories all across the country, and they demonstrate that there's a failure of the federal government's incoherent policies and implementation. Just in the past 2 weeks, the Senate has passed 3 regulations of disapproval on fish and wildlife regulatory actions that have significant consequences on landowners and project developers. On the one hand, the President has been trumpeting the IIJA, and at the same time, the administration is throwing wrench after wrench into the planning and construction process for key infrastructure projects. The Biden administration's alleged statements of support for key infrastructure projects do not match the actions, and so that historic investment, the good it can do, and the jobs and tax revenues it would support is withering on the vine. The service must start striking a balance between recovering species and protecting American livelihoods. And with that, Mr. Chair, I turn it back to you.
Thank you, ma'am. You mentioned Elkins a couple of times in your statement, and I'm thinking a couple of days ago was Mother's Day, and as ranking member knows, my father, their families grew up near Beckley, but my mother, first years of her life, lived in Elkins with her.
And Mother's Day was created by a West Virginian.
It just gets better and better.
Yes, it just all starts and ends there.
All right, that's great. Okay, well, thanks very much, Senator Capito. Now we're going to turn to our witness, no stranger to this committee, and a friend to this committee, and a mother, as it turns out, is on her own right. But Martha Williams currently serves as our nation as the Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Prior to her leadership role, Fish and Wildlife Service, Ms. Williams served as the Director of Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. How long did you live in Montana?
Over 20 years, Chairman.
Since a child, right? Okay, all right. All right, I understand you're a lifelong outdoor enthusiast and enjoy hiking, hunting, and fishing. I remember you talking with us about those passions when you were here for your confirmation hearing. But Director Williams is also the mother of 2 wonderful children, Kate and Ian. How old are they now?
20 and 22. Time flies.
Boy, doesn't it, though? It sure does. So on behalf of our committee, we want to wish you a happy belated Mother's Day, and to Kate and Ian, thank them for sharing their moms with us. Director Williams, welcome back to the Environment and Public Works Committee. Good to see you, and please proceed with your statement when you are ready. Go right ahead. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify on the Fish and Wildlife Service's fiscal year 2024 budget request. At the Fish and Wildlife Service, we connect people with nature. Our mission is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. Today, I will highlight a few of our programs for which we are seeking additional support. Our greatest asset is our talented and dedicated workforce. They work hand in hand with our partners, amplifying our collective conservation efforts. That's our superpower. That cooperative spirit is found across the service. And one example is in our Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. Since the program began in 1987, the service has helped landowners restore more than 7 million acres of habitat on private lands, leveraging program funding with partner contributions at a 4-to-1 ratio, and completing over 1,800 projects this last year alone. For fiscal year 2024, the service is requesting a $19.5 million increase for this Partners program. These projects not only benefit wildlife, but also provide benefits to local communities through improved drought resistance, water conservation, and wildfire resilience. The success of our Partners program shows how our relationships are central to the service's conservation mission, and this is true across other programs, including the Coastal Program, Migratory Bird Joint Ventures, our fish passage work, and more. Collaboration is also key to the progress we are making on protecting, recovering, and delisting species under the Endangered Species Act. Hundreds of species are stable, recovering, or recovered. For example, 3 months ago, in partnership with the Department of Defense, we delisted San Clemente's bell sparrow and 4 other species. 2 months ago, after decades of work across the Southeast with state and local partners, we announced our intention to delist the wood stork. We are requesting an $88.5 million increase for our Ecological Services Program to build on our successes and help recover species by bringing them back to stable populations, as well as supporting at-risk species to prevent the need to list altogether. Ecological Service is also central to our government's consultation and planning capacity to help deliver infrastructure projects throughout the country. Our employees are always looking for ways to improve the efficiency, consistency, and transparency for our consultations. For example, we took the initiative to put in place an online tool designed to streamline consultations, help project proponents build stronger and more efficient consultations. But we're also operating with 20% less staff than we had 2 decades ago. Expanding our workforce capacity will help ensure that the service's consultations aren't a bottleneck for projects. As we increase investment in our country's infrastructure, sufficient workforce capacity is even more critical. The good work we are supporting across the country needs to be matched with responsible stewardship on the lands that the service manages. Our refuge system spans more than 850 million acres of lands and waters and contains 568 refuge units. The refuge system has grown over time, but over the past 10 years, staffing has decreased by nearly 25%. Our request includes an $83 million increase to help rebuild the workforce of the refuge system. It will ensure that we have the law enforcement agents, visitor services staff, and biologists on hand to properly manage these precious lands and waters. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. If enacted, this budget will make a significant difference. And of course, I'm pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Ms. Williams, thanks again very much for joining us today. My colleagues, thank you all for being here, and to our staff who's helped us prepare for this hearing. I want to say thanks to each of you as well. My first question deals with Endangered Species Act consultation and permitting. Fish and Wildlife Service, as you know, is responsible for consulting with other federal agencies to ensure that federal actions, such as issuing permits for infrastructure projects, there's a lot of that going on, as you know, across our country, but to make sure that those federal actions do not jeopardize endangered species. The FY24 budget request from the administration includes a substantial increase to meet this responsibility. The budget request also includes a legislative proposal to increase transfer funds from other agencies for the service to consult on projects funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law. My question is, would you just take a minute or two to talk with us about why these requests in the budget are important to prevent bottlenecks in the environmental review process?
Thank you for that question, Chairman Carper. And indeed, the consultation portion of the endangered species is the backbone of the Act. Countless consultations over the past 50 years have saved individual species and populations from going extinct. And while they can provide for delays, we also complete so many of these consultations on time. As an example, we had over 1,000 formal consultations in the past year, over 11,000 informal consultations, and with the new tool I mentioned in my testimony, the IPAC, we also provided over 22,000 consultations services that didn't even get into the formal process. With that said, we have many consultations that we undertake. They are increasing, which is a good thing, but we also, as you know, need the capacity to be able to complete these in a timely manner. It is a matter of a relationship, as I've been talking about, where we exchange information back and forth with project proponents. And that's what makes these projects sometimes better and provide for conserving these species that are so important to the American public.
All right, thank you. Let me just ask a follow-up question. We hear a lot of concerns, I'm sure you hear them too, about consultation causing project delays. You referred to that. But isn't it true that the vast majority of consultations actually occur quickly? And would like for you just to elaborate on that, please.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Carper. Indeed, the vast majority of the consultations do occur quickly, and very few of them provide delays. Those are typically on the more complex projects where there are more species involved. But I will say that we are willing to work with project proponents and with all of you in providing the best service we can. But these consultations are important, and I think it's the few that become so controversial, and most of them go through more quickly in the informal basis and with no delays.
Thank you. A question that's more directed to Delaware. We all have our interests in our own states. So we're interested in the whole country, but especially in our own states we represent. The bipartisan infrastructure law, as you know, invested, I think, some $26 million in the Delaware River watershed through something called the Delaware River Basin Conservation Act. This funding, which will be spent over, I believe it's 5 years, will support projects that restore habitat and ensure that communities have vitality in their watersheds. I understand that demand for this funding exceeds available dollars, so it makes sense that the service would continue to request regular appropriations, despite the influx of funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law. Here's my question. Would you take a moment to elaborate for us on the service's support for this program? Is it true that you've received more proposals than you can fund?
Thank you, Chairman Carper. And yes, that is true that for the Delaware River Basin Act, we receive far more requests or proposals than we are able to fund. And this is true, I believe, across the board, across the country with programs like this that are collaborative in nature, where we work with so many different partners and leverage funds to get really important work done on the ground. Here's an example of just this year where we are working to restore habitats in Blackbird Creek watershed in Delaware alone, where we've worked with states and other partners. We typically work with NGOs as well, to create 22 acres of dynamic coastal habitat. And what that does is it addresses poorly buffered riparian corridors. It improves water quality and habitat connectivity. It improves coastal resilience, as you are so well aware of, and community protection. So yes, this is a really good example of good government, where we are taking proposals from communities and partners and helping to get that work on the ground.
All right. Thanks for your responses to those questions. Now let me turn to Senator Capito for whatever questions she'd like to ask.
Thank
Senator
you.
Capito.
As I mentioned in my opening statement, West Virginia state agencies are now funding multiple folks in the Services Elkins Field Office to obtain the Section 7 consultations. 2 weeks ago, I introduced the Restart Act with members of this committee. The bill includes a program that would allow for states to assume the Section 7 responsibility of the service. There's precedent for states assuming a federal agency's responsibility under other environmental laws like NEPA. So my assumption would be more efficient for states, rather than using their funds to pay for federal staff to do the same work, indirectly, to do it more directly through the state, and would help resolve the apparent staffing issues that is facing the service. I think I know what you're going to say to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you support an assumption program for Section 7 consultations by the states?
Thank you, Chair. And I have not seen the text yet, but of course I support assistance in achieving these consultations. And I'd like to not have to use transfer authority. I'd like to not have to ask other agencies to help support our capacity to complete our work, hence the budget request before you today. So, and I know that increased capacity is not always the answer. In this instance, it is important.
Are there other ways that your service can work with the states to sort of ameliorate these problems?
Senator Capito, yes. I mean, an example is the IPAC process. I think for us to work with the states in obtaining information and streamlining project proposals, absolutely, it's constantly building that relationship. So yes, there are ways to work with the states. I hope that we already do. Some state agencies, as you have indicated, we have an easier time coming up with memorandums and agreements, but we know it's always important to build out that relationship. So we do work hand in hand, right. And should.
And should, yes.
Yes.
You and I have talked repeatedly about my concern with the uplisting of the northern long-eared bat from threatened to endangered. And I do appreciate that the service delayed the effective date of this listing to further consult with stakeholders on the transition. According to your own agency, bat populations are declining due to white-nose syndrome. Has the service explored the possibility of allowing 4D rules for endangered species that are listed due to effects unrelated to infrastructure development, such as white-nose syndrome?
Thank you, Senator Capito, for that question. And yes, it's something we certainly would consider, but don't feel the Endangered Species Act allows us to have a 4D rule with an endangered status. With that said, in the delayed effective date for the uplisting from threatened to endangered for the northern long-eared bat, we have been working with our partners to get those assurances in place and allow both protection for the bat and for projects to move forward. So while a 4D rule technically is not available for endangered status, we still have lots of options to work with our partners and certainly have a long record track record of doing so with bats, Indiana bats, for example, and northern long-eared bats.
Yeah, I know. I mean, obviously, this particular bat, the northern long-eared bat, is found in, what, I think 37, 38 states.
Yes.
I asked you this on the phone the other day, but I just wanted to get it out. The service is planning to vaccinate bats to prevent white nose syndrome, and what is the progress on that?
Thank you for that question too, Senator Capito. So we are trying to approach white nose syndrome in a number of ways. One is to conserve bats that are still existing so that they are still around for when we do find a solution for white nose syndrome. One option that we are researching is vaccines for bats, but there are a whole number of projects that we are working with all of our partners to try to find a solution to white nose syndrome. And I think we've made some progress, but we certainly haven't solved it.
Thank you.
Senator Padilla, welcome. You're next. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Williams, good morning. It's good to see you here in person. I want to thank you for testifying on the fiscal year 2024 budget and look forward to continuing our work together, not just as a member of the committee, but through my role as chairman of the subcommittee with oversight over the Fish and Wildlife Service. I want to begin by asking you about the legislative proposal in the President's budget to extend good neighbor authority and stewardship contracting authority to the service. I think it's a smart idea, frankly, because I've seen how this authority, which currently only the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management have, has enabled the federal government to work with the state of California to address critical land restoration needs. Would you spend a few minutes just explaining how extending these authorities to the Fish and Wildlife Service would work and how it would improve the service's ability to both manage public lands and benefit private lands?
Thank you, Senator Padilla, and yes, good to see you this morning. Our budget request included 3 legislative requests. One, as Chairman Carper mentioned, for transfer authority, and then also the Good Neighbor Authority and the Stewardship Contracting Authority. So as you mentioned, these have been incredibly successful and helpful for the Forest Service and the BLM. We, the Fish and Wildlife Service, would like to be able to take advantage of this authority. And so what the Good Neighbor Authority does is it really allows us to enter into agreements with adjacent landowners or partners to perform watershed, rangeland, forest restoration work on Fish and Wildlife Service lands. It's part of, I think, building those strong community relationships. And the Stewardship Contracting Authority would allow these non-federal partners to enter into long-term contracts to protect the habitat quality on service lands in exchange, for example, for timber or other forest products. So both would be incredibly helpful in building out our relationships, and really it's providing some innovation on the lands that we manage.
We'll look forward to working with you to advance those proposals through the Senate, through the House, and to implement when they're finally official. Now I want to take us back to your confirmation hearing for a minute. If you recall, I spoke about how I've made equitable access to nature and wildlife a priority of mine. Like 80% of Americans, I grew up in an urban area, specifically the densely populated Southern California region, city of Los Angeles, more specifically where many communities are unable to connect, frankly, with local biodiversity and the natural world for a number of reasons. Moreover, in many local communities, even trees and parks are scarce, and pavement is prevalent. And I mention pavement because when you have enough pavement, when you hit that critical mass, you end up creating urban heat islands, which has the additional effect of keeping kids indoors, particularly in the summertime. I'm concerned that urban communities, in particular our children, do not have the opportunity to connect with nature and enjoy the benefits of connecting with nature. So, Director Williams, can you speak about the importance of the service's urban wildlife conservation program and how your budget request will help increase access to the outdoors for so many Americans who do live in urban areas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Padilla, as I started my comments this morning, I stated that the Fish and Wildlife Service's role is to connect nature to people, or connect people with nature. And so why wouldn't that mean in rural and urban areas across the country? One of the values of the National Wildlife Refuge System is that those refuges are across the country in urban and rural communities and are very much part of the community and should be. So at the moment, we have a focus on the urban wildlife conservation program. So that includes urban refuges, but it also includes urban migratory bird treaty cities to connect people in urban areas with nature. I just 2 weeks ago was in Boise, Idaho with the secretary, where each year we provide $1 million going forward for an urban refuge, and it was awarded to Boise there at the Deer Flat Refuge because of the work they have done with the community, and especially an Hispanic access organization in getting kids to the refuge. I have to say it was one of the best events that I've been to, and that the backdrop of where the secretary spoke was a sandbox where all the kids were playing, and that was more fun than the rest of the event to see them outside and taking advantage of this area. So, Senator, I would love more support and the budget request for increased money for urban refuges. One last point on this, what we have learned through our urban conservation program, we have developed what we call standards of excellence for this program that I would like to apply across the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that is showing up in a community, meeting people where they are, asking the community what they want and need, and really be better partners within the community. So I see that as a model across the board for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Kramer, you are next, and then followed by Senator Whitehouse, and then Senator Lummis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Williams, for being here. Lake Ilo National Wildlife Refuge is a Fish and Wildlife Service managed refuge near Dunn Center, North Dakota. And recently, my office was inundated by calls because there was, the way the Fish and Wildlife Service dealt with, or the local management dealt with a seepage in an earthen dam, which needs to be dealt with, obviously, was to drain it, drain the lake in April. And evidently, and again, only concerned citizens call, but evidently without very good communications with them or the local communities. Now, of course, local groups are dealing with the fallout of that. So these are some pictures of the fallout of that. As you can see, they're cleaning up the dead fish, and it's unsightly, to say the least, and other bad qualities. My bigger concern, and that's a big concern, but my bigger concern is that the permanent fix that the service is going to work on isn't expected to be completed for a couple of years. This is kind of a big immediate problem, and I'm just pleading with you to work with me, tell me how I can help you fix this earthen dam sooner than a couple of years from now, because another spring would be really, really difficult like this. So can we try to work it faster, please?
Senator
Please.
Kramer, I see the photos. I am aware of this issue, and yes, it is really unfortunate and one of the not fun things that we get to work on. Obviously, our primary concern is for the public safety for this dam, hence the drawdown. And my understanding is that we are working to get the design complete and understand, too, the need to do this as quickly as possible. I'm apologized for, if we haven't worked well with the community. I know that we have tried. I even saw some photos from a listening session with the county, but I would like to work with you on this and can understand that it's very unfortunate.
I think the communication problem was more the timing rather than actually eventually getting to it. One of the issues, and while it's a recreation area, it is also used a lot by agriculture. And so when a farmer comes into a spring in a drought area and then their source of water is gone, anyway, you understand all that. I want to help you do this a year sooner if we can do that together.
Thank you, Senator. One thing I read too, one of the comments from one of your constituents was that there used to be a refuge employee there at the Lake Elo National Wildlife Refuge because of our capacity issue with refuges. We have dropped 25% of our capacity. The increased budget request would help us have somebody or an employee at Lake Elo National Wildlife Refuge to work with your constituents in a more frequent basis. So that would be a benefit.
Yeah, it would be. Thank you for that. Now, on to my favorite topic with you is waterfall production area easement mapping. Now, we've made some nice progress on pre-1976 mapping, getting the digital maps, the satellite maps to our landowners who have the easements. And that's certainly improved the look of things and a better understanding of what's actually an easement and what isn't. Unfortunately, I'm hearing that new easements are not receiving satellite maps. So again, I don't know if this is what the issue is, but again, please help me, because what I worry about is not just not having a certain, high-tech literal map of an easement, but it further erodes confidence between the landowner and the service. The other thing is, while I'm on the easement, I also would like to get to a 95% certainty standard, which is what the national or the NRCS at USDA has for their easements, rather than the 99% that the service uses. Just reconciling all of this, I think, would help everybody better understand what they're dealing with. There's, as you know, a lot of confusion even of whether some people are dealing with the Fish and Wildlife Service or USDA. Not your problem, but to the degree we can reconcile some of these things, the better. So what do you know about the satellite maps with new easements? Is that true, or is it, what's the challenge?
So Senator Kramer, first I want to just pull back a minute and recognize the work we have done together, and I think I hope you have improved this situation where we, for the first time, have a national handbook on wetland easements. We have clarified that refuge managers, not law enforcement agents, are responsible for managing easements. We have completed the pre-1976 mapping and appeal process. We have codified for clarity and transportation drain tile setbacks. And so yes, now we're starting this new process. My understanding is that we are working to provide those color satellite photos for the new easement. So that was, I don't have the totally up-to-date information, but that was something that we are aware of, and it's a helpful tool and would like to be able to provide.
I appreciate all of that, and we can talk about more later. The 95 versus 99% deals specifically with the drain tile confidence threshold, and just reconciling that with USDA would be great. Thank you.
Senator Kramer, I would say I'm working diligently. It's something I'm very proud of in this administration across agencies, and I would like to be consistent with NRCS. I do understand that that's helpful to not have discrepancies amongst agencies.
A lot of silos in the federal government. Appreciate you working across them. Thank you.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here, Director. A year ago, I asked you about the effort of the Fish and Wildlife Service with respect to oceans and coasts, because I constantly see underrepresentation of oceans and coasts work across the federal government. The Army Corps flood program has dedicated as little as 1% of its money to coasts. The Land and Water Conservation Fund heavily favors upland and freshwater states and upland and freshwater projects in coastal states. So We who have coastal states and a very significant ocean environment right offshore feel very often that we don't get much attention. Could you let me know what, if any, improvements have been made in the past year so that the oceans part of the United States of America is given something resembling even-handed treatment compared to upland and freshwater?
Senator Whitehouse, I remember that question, and I think of it often. In one way is our request for the increase for our coastal program. And our coastal program is similar to Partners for Fish and Wildlife and other collaborative programs where we provide technical and financial assistance to partners to restore and improve coastal habitat on public and private lands. With that said, Senator, I very much understand and appreciate the really critical role that these coastal lands play, not just uplands, but coastal wetlands are, the first defense against sea level rise and storms, water quality, flood control, et cetera.
Yeah,
They're
even
also
offshore fisheries and reefs and things like that as well.
critical to species. What has improved, I believe, Senator Whitehouse, is that we are working very closely. I'm working very closely with Janet Coit from NOAA
Yep.
and on all of our programs going forward.
He's aware of Rhode Island's problems,
Yes.
having worked as the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management Director.
Correct.
The scale of this is really pretty staggering. The figure I use is zettajoules, the joule being the unit of measure of heat energy, zeta being a number that has 21 zeros behind it. It's enormous. And to put scale to that enormous number of zeros, the entire human consumption of energy on the planet runs at about half a zettajoule. So it's a damn big number.
Yeah.
And for the price of that, because of carbon emissions and because of the magnification effect of the carbon emissions in the atmosphere, the oceans have been estimated to be absorbing 14 zettajoules of heat every year, multiple Hiroshima-level explosions worth of heat per second happening in the oceans. So it's really a dramatic effect, and it's not just a fraction of our fossil fuel energy expenditure, it's a vast multiple. So the oceans are taking a beating far in excess of the actual heat value of fossil fuel or result of fossil fuel emissions. So I think it's really important that we pay attention to that. If you don't mind, we talk often about the monetary value of wildlife, but I'd like to ask you, if the only value of wildlife is seen as what can be monetized, will we do a decent job of protecting our wildlife, particularly in a time of described as a great extinction?
Senator Whitehouse, while trying to calculate the monetary value of wildlife can be a helpful tool, it is by no means the only tool. And part of, I think, about the support for wildlife in this country is the emotional well-being and the sense of awe that wildlife invokes in all of us, even the most ardent detractors. Still, when they see an elephant or landowners who
Or a red knot that flew to Delaware from Brazil.
Right.
Pretty impressive feat for a little bird.
these incredible stories. So yes,
Well, thank you. Keep that in mind, because I think there's a persistent effort to limit our effort to support wildlife and hold off the great extinction to only what can be monetized. And I think we agree that what can be monetized is only a small fraction of the actual value of a healthy ecosystem with robust wildlife. Thank you.
thank you. Beautifully said.
Thank you, Senator Lummis.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ms. Williams, thanks for always being accessible. Even though we don't agree on everything, you've been very pleasant to work with, and we appreciate that, and very accessible. I know that you would be surprised if I didn't bring up the grizzly bear, so I'll bring it up first. The Fish and Wildlife Service is now 4 months overdue on the 12-month review of the state's delisting petition. And I know you've had conversation with the Wyoming Game and Fish on this. Can you provide me an update on the timeline?
Yes, Senator Lummis, very attuned to this issue because I care about it and I want to make progress. I think it is one of the success stories and a story we should be able to tell of how we have conserved and restored grizzly bears. Indeed, the Fish and Wildlife Service, we were behind on the 90-day petitions where the 3 states, Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana, petitioned the Fish and Wildlife Service to delist grizzly bears. So we were behind in finding both Montana and Wyoming's petitions to warrant further review, and we declined Idaho's petition, for which I think we are just about to be challenged on that petition. What that did, though, while we were behind in those findings, is we now go through a 12-month petition review, it's called, where we take the 90-day finding and go in deeper to develop either a proposed delisting rule or a finding that delisting isn't warranted. So we are going through that process right now diligently, and as both you and I understand, we need to do that, following the science and with care so that any solution is durable. What I don't want to see, I don't think any of us want to see, is flip-flops or delays from litigation. I want to get the rules just right.
Well, I urge you to act with vigor on this petition. The grizzly's been recovered for 20 years, 20 years, and yet it's still on the list. And to me, that sort of negates the whole purpose of the Endangered Species Act when it's been acknowledged that the recovery numbers have been consistently met and exceeded since 2003, and yet this species is still listed. So I just encourage you to, act with vigor.
Senator Lummis, the irony is not lost on me of my past career on working on wolves, where in Montana we were working with Wyoming on adequate regulatory mechanisms, and now we are trying to work closely with the state of Montana to help them have the adequate regulatory mechanisms in place to be able to get to a delisting. But thank you.
Now I'm going to switch over to the critical habitat designations. And as Ranking Member Capito noted, there have been 3 different bipartisan resolutions of disapproval to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actions. And that, I think, should put the service on notice that the Congress thinks that some revisiting of the approaches you're taking to definitions of critical habitat and the manner in which certain species are being evaluated could use some rethinking. So I just encourage you to do that. It's actually quite a thing for the Congress to pass Congressional Review Act matters and resolutions of disapproval. So to have 3 come in front of the service in such a short time, I think should give you all pause. So that said, I would like to ask something about migration corridors. There's great bipartisan interest across 11 western states for elk, mule deer, and pronghorn migration corridors. And how does the service's budget request treat migration corridors?
Senator Lummis, thank you for that question, and I do recognize the overwhelming support for migration corridors. Just last week, unfortunately, I was not able to go to it, but there was a meeting in Tucson where the Deputy Secretary, Tommy Boudreau, announced funding, I think it was $4 million for migration corridors. And our budget request does build in corridors, and I can't remember the exact number for that, and I can get it to you, but I very much would believe it's important. It builds support for these really important movements. It gets to the sense of awe in migration and wildlife too. So I will get you the exact number, but I appreciate your support and think it's very important.
Yeah, no worries. We'll follow up with you. Thank you for being here. I yield back.
All right, thank you. Senator Ricketts, Senator Capito and I flipped a coin to see whether or not you would be next, or Senator Bozeman, and Senator Ricketts, you won it this time. So.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Williams, for being here today. So when you're thinking about the fish and wildlife, you all establish goals and metrics for some of the topics that you want to do, like how do you measure success? Is that fair?
Yes, Senator.
And would you agree that it's important to actually have definitions or goals when you're trying to achieve something, if you're going to put together a plan?
Generally, yes, Senator.
Okay. And in reading through the Fish and Wildlife proposed budget, the President's 30 by 30 environmental program is specifically mentioned there. And one report, the executive summary says, the service is a key player in the administration's goal for an ambitious America the Beautiful initiative. And America the Beautiful is what used to be called the 30 by 30 plan, which is to put 30% of the United States into conservation by the year 2030. It goes back to President Biden's Executive Order 14008 that he published on January 27th, 2021. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Yeah. So in that goal to conserve 30% of the United States, what is the definition of conservation? How are you defining conservation?
So, Senator Ricketts, with this question, I have paid close attention, obviously, to the America the Beautiful initiative, and in, specifically to your state, working with the other state directors and with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Understanding from the Fish and Wildlife Service's perspective, conservation includes the principles by which the America the Beautiful initiative was put in place. That includes respecting private property rights, focusing on collaborative, community-based conservation, and that, if you see our budget request for Partners Program, for the Coastal Program, we at the Fish and Wildlife Service are taking the America the Beautiful initiative and asking for the capacity and funding for building those community-based partnership programs.
So one definition that some of the environmental groups have put out there have said to permanently protect in the natural state. Does that mean you disagree with that statement, that conservation does not mean to permanently protect in the natural state?
Senator, that could be one way to define conservation, but there are many, including
But
our
don't you
work
have
with
to have a
landscape.
definition of conservation to be able to say 30% of the United States is conserved? Don't you have to have a definition of that before you can even reach that goal?
Senator, as I said, I think there are many ways to talk about conservation.
But if there's
It comes
many
in
ways to
so
have
many
talk
forms.
about conservation, then how can you know if you actually reach that goal? Because if there's many ways to talk about it, you can have a definition, I can have a definition, but that may mean that we're not at 30% in my view and isn't 30% in your view.
Senator, in implementing the America the Beautiful, the Fish and Wildlife Service, we are focused on our approach and the approach that the initiative set out. I am personally less focused on the numbers and more focused on the approach and making progress with all of our partners.
So when you say you're a key player in the America the Beautiful, you don't really mean getting to 30% of the country conserved by 2030 then?
Senator, that's an audacious goal that I would love to achieve.
So, but if you would love to achieve it, how can you achieve it if you won't define conservation, what conservation means? How can you achieve 30% if you can't even define what conservation means?
Senator, we can achieve it by working with others in all of the ways that the America the Beautiful initiative sets out, which includes, as I've said, a number of ways to achieve conservation. What might be conservation in your state might look different than what conservation efforts would be in Senator Whitehouse's states, coastal versus prairie.
But then you can never get to 30%, because if you're going to change the definitions, you don't even know if you've ever reached there, right?
No, I don't agree with that, but I'm happy to, Senator, I'm happy to visit with you more. We haven't gotten a chance to meet and talk before today's hearing, so I'm happy to come visit and talk through this with you, and what I care about is how we are implementing and doing our work in your state.
So in your budget, how much of your budget is going to the America the Beautiful plan?
Senator, we don't have a line item for the America the Beautiful plan or the initiative. What our budget request asks for, as I started my testimony today, for example, a $19 million increase in our Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, which is most pertinent in your state. So that contributes toward the America the Beautiful initiative, as does our coastal program, as does our request for joint ventures for migratory birds working with our partners, as does our habitat budget request for the refuge system. So there are ways in which we address conservation throughout our budget that recognize the various types of conservation we can achieve.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Chairman?
When Ms. Williams was first nominated for this post, she'd come to us from Montana, where she'd worked for, I think, the governor of Montana, as I recall. But she indicated that in her response to our questions that she would be responsive and would be willing to certainly sit down and talk with us, our staffs, and to come to our states. Sometimes nominees make those promises. They don't keep them. She has kept them. And I would urge you to take advantage of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet.
Thank you.
All right. Senator Bozeman, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Williams, for being here. We appreciate all of your hard work. We've had the opportunity to visit, and we've raised concerns about the Ninth Circuit's 2015 Cottonwood decision. And there you have a situation kind of like Senator Ricketts was talking about. You've got different people that have different views of conservation and maybe use different methods to block things. And so because of that, we have a situation where it's difficult for the Forest Service to get things done. We've talked about rulemaking and things. Can you tell us how that's progressing, or if it's progressing, and the necessity for doing that?
Thank you, Senator Bozeman. And I just have to say, I had hoped to be in your fair state next weekend, where my son's racing in Fayetteville, and I look forward to meeting you there, not just here.
Biking capital of the world.
The biking capital of the world. And we have talked about the Cottonwood decision. What I would say is, and I am very proud of this, as I've mentioned earlier, in our work across agencies and this administration. So the Department of the Interior, we have worked closely with U.S. Department of Agriculture on this issue, where we together provided technical assistance on Senate legislation in the past, and we stand ready to provide technical assistance going forward and helping you through this process.
So you'd like for us to do it, but you're not going to do any rulemaking?
Senator, I believe that a better solution is through the legislation and the the work that we did with USDA to provide technical assistance. I think it's a better fix than regulation.
Tell me about in September 2022, U.S. Fish and Wildlife finalized a rule that prohibits the use of lead fishing tackle and ammunition on 9 individual wildlife refuges. Do you have any scientific data backing that up? Is there a study that says that there's harm? Can you tell me about that?
Senator Bozeman, yes, I'm glad you asked about this question, or asked about lead on national wildlife refuges, because I do think there is lots of different information out there, and I think confusion. So first off, we all know and realize that lead has negative impacts on the environment. As an example, there was just this year a study from USGS, I think in the Journal of Wildlife Management, that demonstrated the negative impacts of lead on eagle populations. For example, when I was the director of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, we had a rehabilitation center. And I remember going to see a bald eagle that had lead poisoning. And if you've seen it, it can cause paralysis, death, tissue deterioration, behavioral changes. It is real, and it is not something that is very pleasant to see. We also know of science shows specific impacts on condors. For example, 120 condors have died from lead poisoning. Nonetheless, for the Fish and Wildlife Service, we are not promulgating a rule prohibiting lead across the system. Instead, what we are doing is working with the Hunting and Wildlife Conservation Council, which thank you for being on the Migratory Bird Conservation Council, and we are working with a joint task force of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies to find ways forward to limit lead on the landscape and think of a way to have affordable non-lead ammunition so that we don't impact access. So hunting is still very important on our refuges, but we would also like to be able to address the impact of lead, and are working with partners and want to work with partners to find a long-term solution for that.
Very good. We appreciate all of your efforts on the Migratory Bird Commission. That is something that is a great success, and I think it's really a good example of how, all kinds of strange bedfellows come together, which is generally a really good thing for a common goal, and have made a big difference. So give yourself a pat for your work in that effort also.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Roseman, thank you for those questions. I got a couple of questions. Senator Capito has a few, and we have about 12 more members waiting outside the hall. We're going to unlock the doors and let them in to grill you a bit longer. My next question, I guess you could say this is a question dealing with science-based decision making. But when the Fish and Wildlife Service makes their determinations regarding species, I'm told it does so based on best available science. This means that sometimes the service proposes to protect species and habitats in ways that are politically unpopular for some constituencies. For example, the service must take climate science into account and must provide protection for species, even when it means the regulations may impact industries that aren't causing the species decline. But what gets less attention are all the ways the service collaborates with states, with tribes, with local governments, with industries and other conservation partners to provide the flexibility and the assistance in implementing these decisions. Would you talk with us for a minute or two about why it's important that science remains at the heart of the service's decision-making? Would you also share with us on this committee today what happens after the Fish and Wildlife Service takes a regulatory action, and all of the ways in which you work with stakeholders on implementation?
Thank you, Chairman Carper, for that question. And certainly science underpins all that we do at the Fish and Wildlife Service. And we implement, for example, the Endangered Species Act based on the science and the law, which, yes, indeed, often brings us into the crosshairs of controversy. But I would argue, Senator, that is our job, is to adhere to the science and to adhere to the law. And sometimes, rarely do we make, rarely do I make a decision that is popular or liked by all. Sometimes I just can't imagine one, that often they are controversial. Nonetheless, the science, the law underpins our work, and we too recognize we must build strong relationships with our partners, whether it's NGOs, whether it's tribes, whether it's states and local communities and industries too. So often there is a lot of interest in an uplisting of a species like northern long-eared bat, of listing of species like lesser prairie chicken, and we would not move forward with those proposals if we didn't think we had the science telling us to do so. We know we are entering the crosshairs in doing this, but the science is very clear on species, those two species especially. But our work with the states and our partners is never done. We can never communicate too much. And my hat's off to the Fish and Wildlife Service employees, USGS, other scientists who help us deliver that science. And on the ground, we are a decentralized agency, and so we do rely on those employees on the ground, hence this budget request. I hope I've answered your question, Senator.
I think you have. I'm going to ask another question. I'm going to ask you to just answer briefly, if you would, please. Then we'll yield to Senator Cardin and then back to Senator Capito. Would you elaborate on the importance of the science applications program? Further, what might the service be able to accomplish with the funding you've requested for this program in the FY24 budget? Go right ahead, and then I'll turn to Senator Cardin. Please.
Thank you for asking that question, Chairman Carper, because it is a program that often goes unnoticed, and our budget request does include an increase for the science applications program, which has been grossly underfunded in the past couple of years. I think in part because people don't always remember or know what science applications does. Sometimes our best work does go we undertake it under the radar. The science applications essentially works with partners to provide science. An example currently is that we have developed a joint task force with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies on landscape conservation. This is where the states have come to us and asked for support from science applications in building out this process. And without this funding, we would not be able to address concerns of the states and or be forward-thinking in landscape conservation. So our science applications is similar to the Partners Program, the Coastal Program, where we leverage monies from other processes and provide technical assistance, and as you asked, the critical science to be making sound decisions. It's very important.
Good. Thank you for that response. Senator Cardin, welcome, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank Ms. Williams for her leadership of Fish and Wildlife. You're one of our major stakeholders in our efforts in Maryland to deal with our coastal area habitats and to deal with the Chesapeake Bay. So I'm going to ask you a few questions in regards to specific budget items. In most cases, I'm pleased. In one case, I'm not, and I will go over that with you. But first, in regards to the neotropical migratory bird conservation, I'm glad to see a significant increase in the president's budget in regards to, this has been a bipartisan effort in our committee to deal with the realities of neotropical migratory birds that are well beyond our shores. A lot of these funds are used in other countries in our hemisphere in which we have migratory birds that come into the United States. First, thank you, and just any comments you have as to how those additional funds would be utilized.
Yes, Senator Cardin, I'm so glad you asked about this program because the neotropical migratory birds are so important. At the moment, the demand for the program far exceeds our funding. So the demand, our budget request bumps up to the demand that we've been seeing of $10 million, whereas we only have funding for $5 million. But I want to give you a really specific example of a bird that I know you and I both care about, and that's the Baltimore Oriole.
It's been doing better of late. I just want you to know.
I'd like to go to a game this year. Just for Mother's Day, I was thinking about Mother's Day and being so grateful to my mother and my children and really Mother Earth, what we're all talking about here. And I was lucky enough on Mother's Day to sit and watch a Baltimore Oriole come into the same spot in the sycamore tree where I've seen it build its nest, and it came around and chose its spot and started to build its nest. And that is thanks to the Neotropical Migratory Bird Program that helps conserve these birds as they migrate out of the country. And those stopovers and wintering grounds are just as important as when they are here.
I was in Ecuador and Colombia, which both raved about our neotropical migratory bird
Right.
programs as how important it is in regards to their game plans. Let me get, if I might, a little bit to our wildlife refuges. We are in Maryland and proud to have 5. Your budget, I want to make sure it's adequate because we want it to be 6. We have a proposed new refuge in the southern part of our state. Are there adequate resources in order to not only preserve but expand our wildlife refuges?
Senator Cardin, not at all. One of my priorities while I am in this position is to get more support for our incredible National Wildlife Refuge system that has been chronically underfunded and where we are understaffed, whether from law enforcement, visitor services, biologists on the ground. So these refuges, as you know, are so important to the communities and to the American public. They're very different than other public lands in that people hunt and fish on them. And there's a lot of interaction on refuges, whether urban or rural. So we are at an inflection point with the refuge system and have asked for a substantial increase to be able to take care of them.
Including the expansion, I hope, into the southern part of our state.
Including.
Thank you. Let me mention one area of disappointment. We established a Chesapeake Wild Program in order to deal with the habitat issues around the Chesapeake Bay. The additional funds in the FY23, we got it up to $8 million, but now there is a suggestion of zeroing it out in your budget. I take it that was just a mistake. You didn't really mean that.
Senator Cardin, the Chesapeake Wild Program is really incredible and is another example of this collaborative approach. What we did is we requested the funding in our science application space so that we can provide these services. But yes, it's a really great program. We'd love to see it funded, but it may not be specifically called out in our budget request.
Thanks for that explanation. We'll try to help you with getting it specifically called out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Your conversation about the Baltimore Orioles reminds me of a couple of times I had the pleasure of going to an Orioles game. I'm a huge Detroit Tigers fan, and Ben's nice enough to invite me to join him sometimes. And a couple of years ago, I was not able to go, but there was a playoff game involving the Baltimore Orioles and the Detroit Tigers, and it was the final game of the playoff. And Ben was kind enough to call me right at the end of the game, and the Orioles had won, and the cheering was like so loud you could almost hear it without, from Delaware. And he held the phone up so I could listen to everybody cheering in Baltimore for the demise of my Detroit Tigers. That's the kind of fan he is.
And I appreciate you not holding it against the Baltimore Oriole neotropical migratory bird.
Never, never, never. We'll find a way to get even, though, but it won't be that way. All right, I think Senator Sullivan next. Senator Sullivan, welcome. Senator Sullivan, I've had the opportunity to sit through a couple of Army-Navy games before.
Yes.
He's a Marine colonel, rather, and I've spent some time in the Navy, and we have different uniforms, but same team. There you go.
Definitely the
Senator
same
Sullivan.
thing. Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Director Williams, thank you for being here. So I've had we were talking earlier, I know in the hearing about consultations, one big frustration of mine that I've, geez Louise, raised with your boss, Assistant Secretary Estenes, and the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs yesterday, the DepSec in Interior, the Secretary of Interior. We're not getting the consultations that we deserve in Alaska. We just don't. And as part of your confirmation process, you committed to me that if you're going to do things focused on Alaska, you'd reach out to the people, you'd reach out to me, Senator Murkowski, our Congressman Peltola. No, you guys aren't doing that. Your agency manages over 70 million acres of land in Alaska. That's bigger than Arizona. No disrespect to the chairman, that's 40 times bigger than Delaware. And you guys, I was in a meeting with the President of the United States recently. I had him a big map of Alaska, 45 executive orders and executive actions the Biden administration has taken to singularly focus on Alaska, 45. And most of them I read about in the newspaper. I mean, it's just outrageous. So I need to get from you again, and I've had this phone call with everybody, if you're going to do something on Alaska, you need to consult with me and Senator Murkowski and our Congresswoman before you do it. I know you get a lot from the radical enviros who tell you to go do these things. You gotta consult with us. Can I get your commitment on that again? I've asked this for everybody. They all say, oh yeah, sure, Senator. And then I read about it in the newspaper again, and I'm starting to get really, really, really mad. And I raised this with the president. I even said, Mr. President, this is wrong. You know it, I know it, it's wrong. So can I get the commitment again in this hearing? If you're gonna do something to my state, reach out to me and the stakeholders first. Center for Biological Diversity is not listed in the Constitution, but the Senate is, and it's a frustration of mine, an enormous frustration of mine.
Chairman Carper, Senator Sullivan, of course, I'm absolutely, I want to work with you on all of what we do in Alaska, and I'm very proud of the regional director that I chose for Alaska, and I think there are a number of projects, impacts, approaches that indicate deep engagement and understanding of the need to consult
Okay, well,
in your state.
good. Let me ask, your mission is to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats. That's the mission, correct?
Yeah.
And is Fish and Wildlife Service a sub-agency then within the Department of Interior when it comes to conservation of fish and wildlife?
Yes, the Fish and Wildlife Service, we talk about it as a bureau
Okay.
within the Department of the Interior.
Okay. And you and I have talked a lot about ANILCA. You've read ANILCA, right?
Yes, Senator.
And have you read the Sturgeon 1 and Sturgeon 2 U.S. Supreme Court cases? 9-0, by the way?
Yes, Senator, but I can't claim to have been the state's Attorney General.
Okay. Good point. You know, that law gives Alaska plenary authority over the methods and take and means of harvest of our fish and game resources, including hunting on federal lands. You're aware of that?
Senator, I should reread the sturgeon cases.
It does. It's not a trick question. So again, I'm just trying to, when there's so much overreach on areas that we think, just from the federal law perspective, provides our state with the management rights of fish and wildlife, fish and game, even on federal lands, again, it's very frustrating. And the amount of frustration back home is really significant. Let me just mention two final ones, because I'm running out of time here. The Fish and Wildlife Service has declined to list the Alexander Archipelago wolf in southeast Alaska as endangered. I wrote you on March 31st on this issue. You've noticed Congress has been very actively overturning through CRAs, the Endangered Species Act listings. I want you to take a hard look at that one. The critical habitat there would be very damaging to the people in Southeast. Very few populations, native, non-native, think that population is declining. We actually think it's objectively healthy, so does our state. If you can take a look at that. And then, of course, there's the King Cove Road. And once again, the Secretary said, we need to consult more with the people. At the same time, they say we're going to do environmental justice. The people of King Cove, the vast majority of whom are native, have been consulted for 30 years. They want the road. She doesn't need to do any more consultation. Of the 900 people there, I think everyone wants the road. They've been consulted. And the Secretary, as she always does, comes up with some big excuse that harms the native people and says we need to do more consultation. Do you have any comments on why you pulled out of that litigation? I appreciate you coming to King Cove, but again, the frustration that my state has felt on that, particularly from the native population of King Cove, is boiling over in a huge way.
Senator, I do have comments on that, and that I think this is, yes, it's controversial. I was able to go there with the Secretary and Senator Murkowski. I know that we had high-level officials there this spring, and my answer is that as the first Native American secretary, she does hear this. She is pushing me to think in new ways, and the point of moving forward is to do so in a durable and lasting way that is more defensible for litigation. So I'm very proud of this administration and this secretary in how she is pushing us to think of our relationship in the state of Alaska in a lasting way. So I look forward to working with you on this issue, and I know there is more information to come and soon, and I know it's a very, very important topic that has bantered around for far too long.
And the wolf in Southeast.
And the wolf, Senator, the archipelago, Alexander Archipelago wolf, we would like to work with you. We have worked closely with the state of Alaska and even had a member of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game on the species status assessment team review. So we are pulling the state into that process, along with others, very carefully. And I understand your interest and the impact.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Senator Capito, thanks for your patience.
Thank you. Yes, I just have two kind of quick questions, I think. In March, OMB and CEQ and the Permitting Council issued guidance on implementation of President Biden's permitting action plan. The guidance directed agencies to submit agency action plans to improve the permitting process. What are some of the, have you submitted your action plan?
I believe Senator Capito was that the action plan is for the department as a whole. I don't believe that the Fish and Wildlife Service submitted a bureau plan.
Did you have input into the overall department action?
Yes, I am working with the department on all of these issues.
And what were some of the strategies and actions that you recommended in this?
Senator Capito, I would like to follow up with you on that.
Okay. Let me ask a question on FTEs. How many people are now working for Fish and Wildlife? What's your full-time equivalent right now today?
It's over 9,000, Senator. I don't have the exact number.
I don't know, you're only
but over
budgeted for
9,000.
8,500, so
Okay.
you already have 500 more than your,
Seasonals, so 8,500. I believe you have the more accurate number before you today.
okay, and you're asking for an additional 817 in the resource management portion, which is, I assume, the Section 7 and all of that. Okay. The reason I'm asking the question is, it came out in our meeting when you came to West Virginia, and I don't know that it's just our state, that there were FTEs that were left unfilled in the office, that there could have been more people working there, and there was budgetary authority to do that, but that the recruitment was low. And now, I think that the Elkins Field office, to their credit, is now filling those positions. So my question is, before we would fill another 800 new positions, do you have your present positions? There's a recruitment issue with federal government. There's trouble getting our federal employees back into the office. There's all kinds of agency jumping, that one biologist might be in yours and then decide to go over to DOE or something like that. So I guess what I'm asking you is, are you at capacity now, full capacity, according to your budgetary constraints?
So, Senator Capito, I think there are a number of ways for me to answer that, and we are not, we're not always at full capacity with people moving around. And yes, we've had a specific focus on the West Virginia field office and building out capacity there,
Right.
which thankfully we have made great strides
Right.
there. Yes, we also, like other federal agencies, are always focused on recruiting top talent. And I would argue that the Fish and Wildlife Service, our employees have been hard at work throughout the pandemic. Some, are law enforcement and refuge staff on a day-to-day basis showing up at the refuges, and others remotely, which is an important tool. So we, at times, though, also have vacancies without the funding to fill them. So part of our request is to be able to fill these positions. For example, in the refuge system, we haven't had the budget to be able to do so. So it's a combination, but having the authority to always be filling in, and then the request in our budget, I believe, will allow us to do a better job and meet the demands that the American public expects of us.
So in your wildlife refuge fund, I'm not exactly sure if this is out of yours or if this is something that we extrapolated from your budget. So you're asking for more people in the National Wildlife, is that true? Wildlife Refuge Fund?
Yes, Senator, we are asking for additional capacity within the National Wildlife Refuge System, which it's down 25% in the last 20 years.
Well, as you know, our Canaan Valley, as we're going to go to together at some point in our future,
Yes, I hope
is a
so.
very beautiful spot, and obviously visited quite frequently, and has some of the best species, both animal species, but also plant species in the world, I think. So thank you very much. Thanks again for your responsiveness. I appreciate the time you spent with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Capito, I know you got to go to Commerce Committee, and thanks for spending so much time with us. And I have several more questions I'm going to just ask him for the record, but I would like to give you the opportunity, maybe if there's a question or two that you've not been asked, that you had hoped to be asked, or would like to pose a question, and then you can answer it. So you can do both the asking and the answering, but something you would expect to be asked, you haven't been, and you'd like to raise it anyway, go ahead.
Thank you.
You know, we don't do this for every witness, so
Thank you, Senator. I
only
think
the
that-
ones from Montana.
and whose name is Martha, because of your wonderful wife. So I appreciate that opportunity and sincerely appreciate that. I would like to take the opportunity, now that you've given it to me, to express or to ask why is our budget request important? And my answer would be that at this time, with a biodiversity crisis, with climate, with a once-in-a-generation investment in infrastructure, that we have a chance to make a difference for the better, for the American people, for communities, and for the ecosystem functions that support all of us. So that this is a very important time for these investments, and for us to meet this moment in time, we need this increase in people and funding to be able to deliver. It's a privilege.
Well, thank you for both the question and the answer. I just chatted with my staff for a moment there while you were responding, and there's a meeting later today at the White House. As you may know, the president is invited back, bipartisan Democrat and Republican leadership from the House and Senate to try to make sure that we avert Armageddon in terms of our fiscal situation and avoid going into default. I hope they're successful. There's been increasing talk about how an issue called, what we refer to as permitting reform, that could somehow end up playing a role to help get us to make sure we don't do something like a self-inflicted wound and default on our debt. I don't know if there's any correlation. There might be a correlation between the Congress providing the kind of funding that the president has requested for Fish and Wildlife staffing, increasing the staffing as we've discussed here today, and that there may be a relationship between our willingness to do that and, in the end, our ability to take the steps that we are talking about doing with respect to permitting reform, so that we can better ensure that the clean energy that's wanted and needed around the country gets there, and we do it in a way that communities are listened to in that process, and we do it in a way that businesses and business in the industry have certainty and predictability. But is there a correlation, or is there a relationship here?
Chairman Carper, I'm so glad you asked that, because there is a direct correlation between the Fish and Wildlife Service capacity and our ability to provide the consultations that do not need to be a bottleneck for infrastructure projects and others. Where we have the capacity, we deliver, and those consultations can proceed smoothly and efficiently. But where we do not have the capacity, it becomes that much more difficult, especially, I believe that we've seen over 30,000 projects, or we've seen a large increase in projects and requests for consultations coming through that we have responded to. With the capacity, we could be that much more efficient. We could be more proactive.
All right. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. That sort of confirms my what I've been thinking. I want to again thank members of our staffs, both minority and majority, for their work in preparing us for this hearing. I want to extend my thanks to our colleagues, Democrat and Republican, who've joined us today. There's I think almost every committee in the Senate is meeting today, either in business meetings or hearings, and so I'm just grateful that we had such a good turnout on both sides of the aisle. I also want to thank you for joining us today. I want to thank you for your testimony today in for your willingness to respond to our questions. We're grateful to you for your service, continued service to this country, and I'm sure they're proud of you back in Montana, where you spent so many years of your life. And you're like we say in the military, so we got a couple of people on here, including Senator Sullivan and myself. We spent quite a few years in the military, and we always say of folks who serve in uniform that we value their service and appreciate their service, but their spouse also serves. We want to say thanks to your family for allowing you to serve first Montana and now our country. Before we adjourn, I want to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a variety of materials that relate to today's budget hearing. Senators, I love it. This is one of my favorite parts of the hearing, when I ask unanimous consent to do something and there's nobody here to object. So I'm not going to object to my own request. So that's it. It's no, without objection, it's approved. But senators are going to be asked if they can submit questions for the record, and they can, and we hope they will, and they can do that through the close of business on Tuesday, May the 30th. And we're going to compile those questions as they submit them, and we're going to send them to you and your staff. We're going to ask you to try to reply to us by Tuesday, June 13th. Not seeing anyone else ask to be recognized at this time. With that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you so much.